Right, welcome to Grand Rounds. I'm not totally sure what camera I'm supposed to look at because I'm using some very fancy Dalhousie building AV equipment today, which I've never used before. But my name is Lesley Crichton. I am one of the chairs of Grand Rounds. And today we have the pleasure of hosting the BMSc Harden Award finalist presentations. So these are medical students who have chosen to do an intercalated degree in medical education, a field in which University of Dundee already has quite a name, in no small part to the work of Professor Harden, and we're delighted to have Professor Harden here with us today. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Kevin McConville just for a minute, just to give a quick background of how these awards have come into being and what the selection process has been like.
Thank you very much, Lesley. Again, welcome all to you along here today, and to Professor Harden, who's with us. Myself and the co-program lead for the BMSc is Dr. Fiona Muir, who's here, and also our external examiner is Dr. Fiona Smart, who's in the audience as well today. So we have a large cohort, 18, 19 in total of BMSc medical students this year. And as part of their process, whilst they've been very busy both teaching, they've also been in parallel conducting research, which they have summarized within poster findings in a short oral presentation that was uploaded into our online area. And Fiona and I had the very difficult task of shortlisting this down into the 5 presenters that you're going to hear from today. So they're going to just give a brief explanation of the research they've been conducting over the last academic year, short opportunity for perhaps 1 or 2 questions in between, and then we will have an electronic link which will allow all of you in the audience to vote for your most favourite presentation of today, and along with, we're hoping, some summation commentaries from Professor Harden. So that's hopefully the plan for today, but I'll be in the background. Lesley will also be here within that. So thank you very much, Lesley.
Right, thanks, Kevin. So we've got 5 presenters to get through today. They're going to have 5 minutes each to talk, and I'm going to run this like a military operation because otherwise we're going to get way behind on time. So for all of the presenters, I'm going to time you, and I'm going to give you 5 minutes, after which point I'm going to give you a warning, and then you're going to get a further minute to finish up, after which I'm going to mute you and then move on to the questions. So just to keep things moving so that we can fit everybody in and get everyone the time they deserve. There will be time after each presentation for probably 1 or 2 questions. And like we always do in Grand Rounds, if you want to raise your hand, I will invite you to ask your question, or if you prefer to put a question in the chat box, we can select some questions from there as well. And then at the end, we'll talk you through the voting process, and we'll invite Professor Harden maybe to say a couple of words at that point as well. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our first speaker, Priya Das, to put her slides up, and then Priya, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to give your presentation.
Perfect. Let me just get my presentation. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, hi, my name's Priya, and today I'll be discussing my research topic, which is titled Student and Educator Perceptions of Peer Physical Examination in an Undergraduate Medical Programme, the Impact of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Teaching and Learning. So on screen now are my research questions, which were devised following a review of literature. Throughout undergraduate medicine, the clinical skills programme plays a central role in the curriculum and aids students in their journey to becoming competent and safe doctors. A significant feature of examination skills development is peer physical examination, known in the literature as PPE. During COVID, the simulated patient system came to a standstill, leaving students to practice with only PPE. The current second year students have had no experience of simulated patients compared to their senior peers, and it's unclear how this will impact their learning and perception of clinical skills. So following this unexpected change, the University of Dundee introduced the Peer Physical Examination Policy and Procedure to provide guidance and structure for PPE within the Clinical Skills Centre. It highlights the advantages of PPE, discusses the considerations needed to ensure it's carried out in a professional and inclusive manner, and includes action plans that must be carried out in case of unexpected findings. PPE has reported advantages, including providing students with an understanding of what it's like to be examined as a patient. However, the literature also describes students having faced barriers to PPE, such as gender, religion, and age, and therefore it is important to explore these along with student and educator perceptions of PPE. A qualitative case study methodology was adopted for this research in the form of semi-structured one-to-one interviews. University of Dundee medical students from years 2 and 5 were invited to interviews alongside clinical skill educators who teach physical examination sessions, and all data was analysed using Ron and Clark's thematic analysis, and a theme map was constructed. So moving on to the study's findings and discussions. The findings of this study indicated that both educators and students agree that PPE has significant advantages, which have been recognised even more now that there have been no opportunities to use simulated patients. Current second year medical students at the University of Dundee are more comfortable performing physical examination on their peers, and this has been described as likely due to the increased PPE exposure, and this can be demonstrated by the following quotation: "I think there would be a natural correlation between the benefit you get from PPE and how comfortable and relaxed you feel participating in it. I think there would be greater benefits because students are less hesitant and just willing to get fully engaged." However, despite the benefits of PPE, there are perceived barriers linked to body image, embarrassment, comfort, and gender. Students stated that there is a substantial disparity in the ratio of male to female volunteers for PPE, such that it has impaired their PPE experience, resulting in fewer opportunities to practice examinations on females and so hindering their learning. And this can be demonstrated in the following quotations: "The majority of time it's the boys in my group that volunteer, especially if it's an examination which requires taking your top off, and we've not really been exposed to female examinations. We weren't prepared enough to actually deal with a female patient." Students also suggested that educators frequently disregard females' attempts to volunteer in front of the class. While this may occasionally reflect student thinking, it's possible that some of these beliefs are shaped by the way educators run their clinical skills sessions. When educators were asked about this topic, there were varying responses such as, "I just assume that the males or females would want to be separate. I don't want to make the assumption that all females in our group are happy to be examined by all of the males. And I certainly don't look to any one person when suggesting need to volunteer. It's what we advocate our teachers to do in general." Educators felt that there has been a gradual shift in recent months from mostly same-gender PPE groups to more mixed-gender groups, perhaps as a result of the PPE policy being implemented. However, my research revealed students aren't aware of or aren't reading the policy, and therefore the transition is most likely due to increased exposure to PPE, and as a result, students feeling more confident to participate.
Time up in 10 seconds.
The following recommendations are proposed. The PPE policy should be included in the student charter, with students signing it to indicate that they have read and understood it. The Clinical Skills Centre may benefit from consciously choosing which sessions simulated patients are invited to and considering which might benefit more from PPE. And furthermore, the Clinical Skills Centre should explore the possibility of assigning male or female simulated patients to specific examinations or sessions. And in addition to these, recommendations for future research may be to explore whether the changes made to physical examination teaching at the University of Dundee because of the COVID-19 will influence the mastery of physical examination skills by student cohorts in the future, and whether educators discouraging female students from participating or volunteering to be examined during PPE is a common issue within other medical schools. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Priya, and well done for fitting into the 5-minute slot available.
Thank you.
Right, I'm going to invite anybody who would like to ask a question. I was wondering if Professor Harden was unmuting himself there in preparation.
No, first of all, congratulations. I think this is an important topic. Well, I think one of the biggest trends in medical education we'll see over the next 5 years is greater involvement of students as partners in the learning program in all sorts of ways. And I think this peer physical examination is just part of peer teaching, peer learning, and so on. And I think it has major advantages. So I think this is an important topic. I just wondered, looking ahead, where do you think this will be in 5 years' time? And do you think this will be reflected in exams like OSCEs as well? I mean, what will be the position of peer learning, peer teaching, and this peer examination in the future?
Yes, so obviously there's been a change in recent years just because of COVID, and sort of asking educators and students this exact question. It's thought that in the next couple of years it will go back to sort of a mix of simulated patients and PPE as opposed to just PPE at the moment. However, I think the advantages of PPE definitely are more obvious now that they've been no simulated patients, and that's kind of all we've had to rely on. So I definitely think there might be a bigger use of PPE going forward, just due to COVID and the reliance on it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question, and I can see that Fiona Smart has her hand up.
Hi, Priya. I really enjoyed that. And again, yes, it is a really important topic. What was the biggest surprise for you in your data?
The biggest surprise was definitely some of the difference in opinions of educators on whether they think that male and female students, whether they want to work together, whether they don't want to work together. And I think it just reflects that it is definitely a student choice and a student preference, personal preference, and therefore probably going forward, just that sort of discussion needs to be had before PPE sessions go ahead, whether students want to work with same gender or mixed gender groups.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Priya. We're going to move on to our next presenter now, who is Annie Gould.
Hello, I'll just get my screen shared.
No problem.
Can you all see that okay?
That looks good, Annie.
Perfect, okay. So, good afternoon everyone. My name is Annie Gould and I'm going to be discussing my research project, which is professional identity formation in Dundee medical students with chronic health conditions and/or physical disabilities. Professional identity development information is a multidimensional phenomenon that has no end. It can be described as a transformational process occurring between the transition of a person to physician, in addition to internalising professional core values and beliefs. An individual's development of their professional identity is one of the most crucial aspects of medical education, therefore a relevant and central lens through which to consider medical school. Central themes have been identified as having the greatest influence on professional identity, these being positive role models and reflecting upon clinical experiences. However, there appears to be a lack of inclusion of the diverse forces at play within developing an identity within the medical education curricula, particularly in relation to medical students with physical disabilities and/or chronic health conditions. To the best of my knowledge, there has been no direct research on the impact chronic health conditions and/or physical disabilities have on medical students' identity formation. And so as a result, we created the aims of this research to reflect this. The study further focused on 3 research questions to understand how these individuals form their identity, how their identity is impacted, and how the hidden curriculum affects their identity. This study adopted a qualitative social constructivist interpretist approach through narrative inquiry, which was one-on-one semi-structured interviews. The data from all 8 of the participants was then anonymised, transcribed, and analysed thematically. Consequentially, 6 key themes and 13 sub-themes were identified, which can be illustrated in the finding sections of the poster. But before I go back to this, I would like to draw out 2 illustrative examples, which are: firstly, the positive impacts individuals felt their chronic illnesses or physical disabilities have on their identity. Individuals believe that through being in both the patient's shoes and a medical student's shoes, they feel they have an altered perspective, which has allowed them to develop a deeper understanding and greater empathy towards patient. Participant 6 articulated this well when they said, "I think it can impact in a positive way because you have that sympathetic and empathetic viewpoint towards patient groups." In addition, I would like to discuss a contrasting perspective: the negative impact individuals felt their chronic illnesses or physical disabilities have on their identity. Individuals described experiences whereby their chronic illness or physical disability has impacted them both negatively in a socially and academic way. Participant 4 said, "It can cause me quite a lot of pain. I'm kind of fatigued and tired, so both kind of socially and academically, it is something that can be quite limiting." I'd now like to discuss my findings in the wider context. Students appreciated the value in both positive and negative role models in forming their professional identity. Whilst positive role models provide behaviours and attributes they want to incorporate into their professional practice, they also appreciated that negative role models can either be a positive learning experience or one that is detrimental for their professional identity. Similar to role models, clinical experiences have a vital role in helping to shape their identities. Interestingly, students felt that the medical school has created an environment which is binary, in the sense that there is a clear right and wrong way of doing things. How do we change this to move towards a more hospitable, adaptive, and inclusive environment? This is relevant to both doctors within and outside the medical school and society as a whole. Furthermore, these individuals believe their chronic health conditions and physical disabilities have had both a positive and negative influence on their identity. Individuals now have a deeper understanding and greater empathy towards patients. However, individuals did disclose that they have suffered from mental health conditions and feelings of frustration as a result of their illness or disability. This work shows that support for these individuals is fundamental. The majority of participants felt that they were supported well by the disability services and the medical school. However, participants said that it would be beneficial if the support services were more proactive rather than reactive, and that support groups with other individuals experiencing the same thing would be of benefit. In conclusion, this work has exemplified the importance of role models and clinical experiences in the shaping of professional identity from the perspective of students with chronic health conditions and/or physical disabilities. In addition to this, we conclude that chronic health conditions and physical disabilities have impacted medical students' identity multifactorially. While support is available for these students, we conclude that a more proactive approach to identity formation is required. This is likely to benefit all students and trainers regardless of their physical ability or health condition, and would help reduce both barriers to training and professional development, and foster a more inclusive curriculum. In future research, it would be interesting to consider the perception of the members of staff in the medical school to consider how they regard these issues from a different perspective. Thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Annie. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask?
I kick off again and just say again, thanks very much for a great presentation on a very, very important topic. In the past, it's been neglected, and great to see that we're doing something about it. Could I ask you, Annie, as you point out in this and other areas, role models are key important as part of the education program and professional identity formation. And we all hope that they're good role models. But I think one of the dilemmas is, what do you do if there are bad role models? And do you think the students should be given more help to what do they do with bad role models, recognizing that it isn't always good role models we'll see, but what should they do if there are bad role models?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, because I feel a lot of the time students have encounters with negative role models, but maybe don't know how to go about improving their encounter, their interaction. So I think it comes from both, like, you should attack it from both the student's point of view and the educator's point of view. So if the student does have an encounter with a negative role model or an educator, to speak to them, discuss how they feel, and hopefully they can come to a way of improving the teacher's experience. Or the other option is to educate the staff or the pupils more to improve their ability to be better role models.
Good, excellent, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, does anybody else have a question? I'm just looking through. You're smart, you have your hand up, but I'm not sure if it's from the last one.
No, it's a new hand. Sorry, I wasn't behaving very well with my hand. Annie, that was really interesting. How did you choose the people to talk to? How did you select your sample?
So I worked with another student who was also looking at the mental health consequences of this topic. So myself and my colleague, we created a recruitment email that we sent out to all the years of the medical school. So it was year 1 to year 6, including BMSc. And we also got ethical approval to put them onto yearbook chats, which we actually found was the best way of recruiting people. And then they responded to us if they were interested with a completed consent form. And that's how we went about recruiting people.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
I think it's time for one more question, if anyone else would like to ask one more before we move on. Okay, I've got one. The last two projects actually have spoken about using thematic analysis in your methodology, and I'm really interested in how you have got on with that, and whether you have found it's easier to do just with a pen and paper, or whether you use software, and whether you've got any learning to share with the rest of us who may also be learning how to do it.
Yeah, so initially when we got told thematic analysis was what we were going to be doing, I was a bit panicked because I'd never heard of it before and I had no idea what it involved. So my supervisors were very helpful in that. So my supervisors were Lesley Gordon and Sarah Ross, and they're really helpful with giving us a kind of template to follow. So the first thing we did was go through our data sets and pick out some initial themes. And then we tried to get them to match all the data sets. And something we use, which I found quite helpful and I'd never used before, was In Vivo, the software. Initially, when I first got it, it was very overwhelming. There was lots of different things I'd never seen before, but I thought that was very helpful. And similar to Priya, I think she mentioned, I also used Braun and Clark's guide, which was useful. But I think it's definitely a learning process. So I think in future research is something that I'll hopefully get better at.
Yeah, it feels like something that would get better with lots of repetition, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
All right, Annie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're going to move on to our third speaker now, and our third speaker is Caroline Armstrong.
Hello, I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see this all right?
Perfectly.
Okay, so my research this year was about the representation of the female body in the medical curriculum, and it was an exploration of the process behind the selection of images for teaching materials. So the idea of the male as the default human and any deviation from this is atypical is a phenomenon that has kind of always existed in medicine, but it's kind of only recently begun to be questioned by researchers. And this idea of the male body as the standard or the blueprint human within medical education is within medical education too. So researchers found that it's in the textbooks that we use, the lecture slides we present, and the case examples we discuss. And a recent content analysis of the University of Dundee anatomy slides has found a similar trend in this medical school too. So this research found that across all system block anatomy teaching, excluding reproduction, only 36% of the images and sketches on the lecture slides depict a female body. And my research aimed to build upon this, and I explored one way that this may arise by interviewing the tutors that are creating this teaching material that has this gender bias. So the research aimed to understand the process behind the designing of the teaching materials and which factors may be at play when selecting one image over another. It also aimed to explore the tutors' opinions of the underrepresentation of women within medical education and potential solutions to this. So it's important that we teach students about how different diseases may present in different bodies in order to produce doctors that are safe, open-minded and competent. So the content we deliver must be representative of the population that it serves. So my data was collected over the course of 9 one-to-one semi-structured interviews on Microsoft Teams. And the interview participants were any individual that had designed or delivered a teaching session to year 1 to 3 within the system blocks in the School of Medicine. And the participants were recruited via email, and I relied upon voluntary participation, otherwise known as convenient sampling. And the interviews were transcribed afterwards, and the data was analysed using Braun and Clark's 6-step approach to thematic analysis as well. So in terms of my findings, so throughout the interviews, kind of 3 major themes were identified that corresponded to the research questions. The first related to the process of selecting images for the teaching material. So medical educators identified a multitude of barriers to selecting images of women. The main was a fundamental lack of images existing in the first place. And those that did exist were often difficult to find or less medically accurate. There were also concerns raised, particularly by male tutors, about the connotations around displaying a nude female body and the risk of being accused of inappropriateness. Therefore, selecting images to them felt safer. And images were also discussed by tutors as a tool to dictate the subconscious of what is normal to students. And if you look at the first pink box, you can see a quote there in which the participant believed that students are exposed to something repeatedly, they will start to consider this to be the normal or the standard. It was also surprising to hear how heavily the tutors relied upon Google as a source of images. This was due to the ease and the speed of it. My second major theme was around gender bias and the perspectives of this in medical educators, and there was some variation in views amongst the tutors. Many admitted that the underrepresentation of women is not something they had ever considered, but when questioned, the views tended to fall into kind of 3 main categories. The first was an acknowledgement of the underrepresentation of the female body, and this was often perceived as a negative or something that required addressing. The second one was an acceptance that this was the case, but it was considered to be just the way that anatomy or medicine was, and it's because it's the nature of it, it's hard to change it. And lastly, some denied the relevance of sex and gender in medicine and argued that in the majority of medicine, as long as the core sciences were addressed, it didn't really matter. And these findings followed really closely to similar research in the area with medical educators. Furthermore, many thought of this as a reflection of medicine as a whole, in which the male standard is seen in our textbooks and our journals. And you can see an example of this in the second box. In terms of potential solutions, some tutors mention the value of raising awareness through initiating conversations and research such as this to bring the importance of representation onto the radar within medical education. At a curricular level, gender issues and teaching about sex differences need to be integrated across the curriculum and mentioned in different settings by different clinicians rather than as the odd token session. And this is talked about in the green box. On a more practical level, though, more accurate and high quality images of women need to be produced and made available for use by tutors, either in a shared folder or a bank of images. So, to conclude, there are significant barriers to medical educators to creating teaching materials that are well representative of the female body. Access to medically accurate and diverse images is a key part of integrating gender-sensitive medicine into the curriculum, and more research is required into how this can be done, especially at Dundee. The representation of women, particularly with the consideration of intersectionality, should be part of the ongoing discussion at the University of Dundee and within the medical curriculum, and how we produce the next generation of safe and open-minded doctors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Professor Harden, I think you would like to ask a question.
Again, another great and important presentation on the representation of teaching images. I think this is an important topic which also is attracting more attention. And I think you obviously tackled it from a gender balance. I wondered if you also thought about it, because the other area that's come in for a lot of concern in this area is not just gender, but is ethnic background, and in particular things like dermatology, where it's been really quite difficult to teach lesions, which almost all are used as white skins. And it's and also age is another area. And I wonder also if you thought about it, not just in illustrations, but the selection of cases or patients for teaching in terms of even in exams and patient management problems or problem-based learning. Again, there's been evidence that there's a gender balance there as well, gender bias. So it's a great thing, but it just what you're doing is opens it up to a much greater perspective. But thanks for raising this, an important topic. Thanks. Well researched too.
Thank you. Yeah, I kind of, when I was starting my research, it's a broad topic, and actually I had to decide to focus it down onto gender, because, I think it would be an omission not to mention race. So thank you for bringing that up. And I mentioned it a bit in my dissertation as well. And I think there's a focus just now in the curriculum review on race and ethnicity, and I think that's a really important topic, kind of with the BMA race charter and stuff. So that's definitely something that I think should be thought about, and kind of within the curriculum review, with race being talked about, gender can also be part of that. And as well, with some of the literature that I was looking at, a lot of them were talking about the case examples, and again, the same similar theme of the predominance of the male body and the male patient was coming up and again, and that again brings up this idea of the standard as not just the male, but the slim, white, mid-30s man as the standard. But actually that is a very small portion of the population. It's really important that we teach students that that's not the blueprint of patient you'll see a wide variety of them, and you need to be comfortable treating every sort of patient that you'll see.
Thank you so much. And just before I go to Fiona Smart for the next question, I just want to draw everyone's attention to the chat box where, somebody Laws, I can't read your full names, has said, we have a fantastic range of illustrations here by our previous TILT team intern, Lucy Southwell, showing the female body as well as a focus on diversity. And there's a link in the chat to that. It's like a fantastic resource.
Hello, sorry, I just thought I'd pop my camera on quickly there. Yes, my name's Eve Laws, I'm the medical artist in the TILT team. And just wanted to say it was fantastic. I really enjoyed your presentation there. We're really focusing at the moment on creating a range of illustrations, 3D models, animations on including diversity and also representation of female anatomy as well. I would love to have a chat with you at some point about some of the findings that you found out, and potential work that we could create to benefit the curriculum, definitely.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. I can send you my dissertation over and we can have a chat.
Oh, that'd be brilliant. Thank you. Yes, that's great.
Happy to have made that match during this session. Move on to Fiona.
I really enjoyed listening to you talking about that. When did you become alert to this, Caroline? Where were you in your studies when that penny dropped about what you were seeing and not?
I think it was a gradual thing. I think it's one of those things that most people probably won't have even thought about it. But I was actually reading a book, and I think a lot of you might be familiar with it. It's called The Invisible Woman, and it talks a lot about the gender data gap in general, but I was particularly interested by one chapter that was about images of women, and that I read that and I was like, that is so right. It's something I've never thought about. Even as a woman, I've never thought about the representation of women, and that really opened my eyes. And see, as soon as you start to see it, you see it everywhere. It's all throughout society. So it's really important to kind of bring awareness to it.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Fantastic. Right, I'm going to move on to speaker number 4 now, who is Alina Thomas. Alina, there's lots of time for you to upload your slides and things.
Yeah, sorry, I have a bit of a cold, so my voice is a little bit croaky.
Don't worry, it'll come across just fine.
I'll just start sharing my screen. Okay, can you see that?
You can see that perfectly.
Oh, that's excellent. Okay, so hello everyone, my name's Alina and I will be presenting my dissertation findings titled Ophthalmologist Perceptions Regarding a Low-Cost Strabismus Surgical Simulation Model. So simulation is a well-established concept within medical education, and following a literature review I conducted, there are several simulated options to practice surgical skills within ophthalmology, but a lack of low-cost alternatives, especially within strabismus or squint surgery. So this is of concern as low-cost simulation has been shown to be beneficial to trainees via a strabismus simulation model by Malik et al. And the Royal College of Ophthalmologists policy dictates that trainees require 20 strabismus surgeries before completion of training, 5 of which can be simulated. But even with this concession, trainees have been struggling to reach this number. Currently, one of the commercially available strabismus models costs approximately £50 per eye. These are relatively low-tech, single-use and synthetic, and they look very similar to the models that you see in the images. So the self-made model I used in this project, which is shown in the images, costs less than £2. So that's quite a difference in price. So the wet white that you see simulates the conjunctiva, the cling film is the Tenon's capsule, the foam is the sclera, the felt are the 4 recti muscles, and it's all supported on a cork board with push pins. So with this project, I hope to ease the financial burden of simulation training for ophthalmologists while also helping trainees reach the target of 20 strabismus surgeries, if my model proved to be as effective as other commercially available models. So the research questions I sought to address were: what are the perceptions of ophthalmologists using a low-cost strabismus surgical simulation model? How can the model be modified to improve its purpose? And more generically, what are the ophthalmologists' perceptions regarding simulation in postgraduate training? So in order to answer these research questions, I adhered to a qualitative research design using an action research model with a pragmatic paradigm in mind, as the focus was on inquiry and application of knowledge. So the first step in this project was actually making the model, and for that I used a video by Malik et al. This was followed by piloting the model and interview guide on the supervisor to increase the credibility of the results. So participants were selected using purposive sampling to to allow recruitment of those most knowledgeable in the field of strabismus in the local context. So the inclusion criteria comprised of consultants and associate specialists working within 9 Wells Ophthalmology Department, and the trainees were recruited by the other lead researcher of this project. Ethics was obtained through the University of Dundee Ethics Board. So the participants were invited to interview via email recruitment through an external gatekeeper, and used semi-structured interviews to obtain a rich data set. The participants practiced surgical skills on the model and were then interviewed. So overall, there were 11 participants, which consisted of 7 consultants and 4 associate specialists. And interviews were transcribed by hand and then thematically analysed using Vaughan and Clark's frame, same as the others. So overall, 4 themes were identified, and this slide outlines the 4 main themes and sub-themes with a few sample quotations. So all participants, apart from the strabismus specialist, commented that their only experience of strabismus surgery was during their training. However, 8 of 11 participants agreed that there were some transferable skills to be gained from strabismus surgery, such as performing peritomies and muscle disinsertions as part of trauma surgeries, which is a skill that all ophthalmologists need to be competent with. All participants commented that using the model refreshed their knowledge of the strabismus surgical skills, and none of the ophthalmologists had experienced simulation-based education as part of their postgraduate training. But they all agreed that it's a very useful learning modality for learning skills in a safe, non-threatening environment. However, they all said it cannot replace real-life experiences, as certain things cannot be replicated. All participants thought the model was a good resource for learning the fundamental skills, such as identifying the correct equipment and understanding the basic anatomy. The strengths of the model were the authenticity of the scleral tissue for passing sutures and the ability to practice all the key steps of strabismus surgery. The main weakness was the lack of muscle elasticity simulated by the felt material, and many suggested improving this by changing the felt to a rubber band. Lastly, various barriers to training were identified, such as higher patient expectations and a lower number of strabismus surgeries. So for this reason, most were happy with the Royal College's strabismus simulation guidelines, as it was seen as an opportunity to increase surgical competence in a safe environment before implementing the skills on a real patient. So to conclude, this study adds a fresh qualitative perspective to Malik et al.'s paper by providing recommendations for implementation and improvements regarding a low-cost strabismus surgical simulation model. The model was praised for its simplicity and low cost, with many saying the skills achieved with my model were comparable to the commercially available counterparts. The use of simulation in postgraduate training was looked on favorably by all participants, and many see this as a way to bridge the gap between real-life surgeries and the various barriers identified by the participants to surgical training. So directions for future research include completion of the action research cycle by implementing and further evaluation of the changes suggested by the participants, and also data triangulation with the trainee data to gain the perspective of a larger cohort of ophthalmologists. Those are some references, and that's my presentation. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Alina. Does anyone want to start off with a question?
Kick off again, another excellent presentation, and there's a lot of interest in the moving from very high cost, high fidelity simulators to low cost simulators. So I think this is spot on. I just wonder, do you see this being used mainly for teaching or also for assessment there? And secondly, what do you see? I mean, it's an exciting start you've made, but what do you see? Where do you think this will go? Will this become a routine model that will be used in Dundee, or where do you see this going now?
So thank you for this question. So the first question about assessment, actually, that's a question that I wasn't too sure about myself, because in the policy guidelines, it says 5 can be simulated, but the guidelines have not specified it has to be a high fidelity model or not. But if it's for, say, practicing skills such as just suturing, it is very easy to do that with the model that I have made. So it is very possible. And then directions for future use. I think this can very much be used, especially for trainees at the start, to get to grips with the process, and then graduating onto maybe some more higher fidelity models, and then going on to surgery. So a lot of the participants actually said this as well, like this could be the first stage, and then people can build their skills, or even ophthalmologists who've taken a break from surgery for a while could use this model first and then go back into surgery.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Fiona Smart.
Thank you. Two commendations and a question. One on your innovation, because that's really interesting what you did. The other commendation is you inserted within your process member checking. How useful was it?
It was actually really useful, and it was more useful than I expected, because one of the participants actually emailed me back saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I forgot about a simulation experience I had while I was a trainee. I used pig's eyes or something like that to practice suturing skills." So I would never have gotten that bit of information if I hadn't checked with her. And there was also another incident when I'd copied down something that someone had said, but then they actually replied to me saying, "Sorry, that's not quite what I meant it's not written in the way I meant. So could you change it to this?" So it was actually very useful, and I'm very glad I did it.
It's really good to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. And then just a comment in the chat from Sue Somerville saying, "Alina, you might want to talk to Rodney Mountain, for example, or colleagues in the DIHS about developing this prototype, an exciting idea for low and middle income countries as well as the UK."
Oh, that is very exciting. I will do. Thank you.
That's certainly what struck me. And as someone who does lots of simulation because I'm an anaesthetist, and someone who's also worked in low and middle income countries, often what we found is that the value of simulators aren't so much in the actual procedure, it's all the stuff around it as well. So the preparation, the consent, the troubleshooting, what do you do when things don't go as well as you'd hoped, and the documentation. So actually the fidelity of the actual bit of kit to do the actual thing is only a tiny part of what it's useful for. And I wondered if anyone had found.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the main thing that all the consultants pretty much picked up on. They weren't that fussed about that it was a googly eye on a ping pong ball. They really valued the process, like you quite rightly said. Definitely.
Well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're going to move on to our final presenter now, who is Sarah Black. I invite you to put your slides up, Sarah.
Can you all see that?
We can. You're very quiet though.
Oh, really?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'll try and speak louder.
Perfect.
So good afternoon. My name is Sarah Black, and my research question and title of my dissertation was General Practice, Systems in Practice, the Impact upon the Development of Students' Clinical Reasoning Skills, a Phenomenological Study. So clinical reasoning is a multi-layered and multi-component capability that allows doctors to make challenging decisions of complexity and uncertainty. It's therefore crucial for medical students to develop clinical reasoning skills to perform well as a doctor, and this is actually highlighted by the GMC outcomes, which state that a, quote, doctor should be able to explain their clinical reasoning based on all available evidence. So as part of Dundee Medical School's curriculum, there's a longitudinal General Practice Systems in Practice, which in short is GPSIP programme, which runs from years 1 to 3. So with regards to the existing literature, it was found that 87% of students agreed that their clinical reasoning skills had improved from longitudinal GPSIP or GP teaching in the past. However, although this paper conveyed that GP facilitated teaching is beneficial, it did not address that the GP teaching was in hospitals instead of medical schools. And so this was the gap which I aim to fill with this research. So when conducting the research, a phenomenological approach was taken and participants were interviewed via one-to-one semi-structured interviews. All data was anonymized and transcribed before being analysed via thematic analysis. The participants identified for this research were third year and BMSc students. BMSc and third year students were felt to be most appropriate due to them being the only cohort of students to experience the so-called normal GP SIP teaching in person. And this was due to the pandemic causing all subsequent year groups to move online for their GP SIP teaching. Therefore, myself and my supervisor decided that to gather well-rounded and realistic data relating to the GP SIP teaching, it would be best to retrieve it from students who had received the normal GP SIP teaching prior to the pandemic. Furthermore, a reflexivity diary was kept when developing the interview guide and analysing the data for this research project. And this was just done to allow me the opportunity to reflect on my influence on the research and help to maintain integrity of the research, which was particularly important as an insider researcher. So overall, 6 interviews were carried out, 3 of them with current third year medical students and a further 3 interviews with BMSc students. There were 5 main themes which became apparent after analysis, and these were case-based teaching, tutor input, educational development, pre-work for sessions, and clinical reasoning. There were also 14 sub-themes. When analysing the data, the utilisation of cases linked to the participants' current teaching block was perceived to be the most beneficial aspect to GP SIP when trying to develop clinical reasoning skills. Interestingly, this actually linked to the existing literature, which found that 95% of students who completed renal cases within small groups during their urology and renal teaching blocks agreed that these were integral to the development of their clinical reasoning skills. However, despite some of these positive aspects, when I was conducting the interviews, students expressed that they were not receiving cases consistently, and this was having a negative impact upon these skills. Students stated that they were, quote, tagged on to the end of sessions rather than what the session was about. And the inconsistency of case usage was highlighted by many students, such as one who said, quote, my flatmate would only talk about cases every few weeks, so it made GP SIP not feel like it was very important as you could pick and choose what you were taught. Furthermore, some participants had switched tutors about 2 or 3 times, and this was a further factor which negatively impacted the development of their clinical reasoning skills. It became clear that although the students did value their GP SIP inputs, they expressed mixed opinions over the reasoning behind GP SIP and whether it was fully developing the essential skills to become a successful doctor. So this prompted participants to suggest changes to the current programme, which included a need for the teaching to become more clinically focused so that the teaching would be standardised between groups, and also to give students the opportunity to present their clerkings, as they felt this would give themselves the chance to be more involved with the teaching. So in conclusion, with one continuous tutor and the consistent exposure to cases within the sessions, GP SIP is successful in developing medical students' clinical reasoning skills. The participants identified that there is a clinical shift which is required within GP SIP to better facilitate the teaching of their clinical reasoning skills. But as identified by the participants, a potential way of doing this would be to ask students to present their own clerkings so that they can immerse themselves within the clinical element of the cases. And if Dundee Medical School can achieve this clinical shift, then their students will be better fulfilling those GMC guidelines and ultimately will become safer and more prepared for the clinical environment post-university. So thank you very much. That's my presentation done. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and I'll hand over to Professor Harden.
Again, another excellent presentation on a very important topic, clinical reasoning. It's interesting to note that over the years at the AME conference, one of the topics that's been increasingly addressed, and with the number of papers submitted, is clinical reasoning. So it's very much on people's agenda. And this year, again, we have a whole series of papers on that topic. So you've addressed a very important area. It's a very useful study. Could I ask about your study? If you're doing this again, is there anything you do differently?
That's a really good question. I think it would be very interesting to see the development throughout the year groups. So in first year, what were their kind of perceptions of clinical reasoning with their kind of limited teaching, and then see how that progresses as they go through second year and then into third year. And I suppose it would be particularly interesting to see that impact of COVID-19, because subsequently from that, the teaching has gone online. So I suppose seeing the contrast of those who have had it in the classroom and those who are online would be very interesting to see.
Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you so much. And I'll hand over to Fiona.
Thanks, Sarah. Was there anything that you were expecting to see in the data that didn't come through?
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, I thought there would be a very positive side of GPSIP, and I thought that most of the answers would have kind of shone a positive light on GPSIP, and it wasn't the case. There were very mixed opinions over whether it's actually a good kind of aspect of the curriculum to develop clinical reasoning skills. So it was really interesting to be able to immerse myself in the data and see all those mixed opinions and then analyze them to find the themes.
Fascinating, thank you.
No problem.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. So after those 5 fascinating, diverse presentations, I'm going to invite you all, if you haven't already, to visit the voting link, which is in the chat box. Please go and vote for your favourite, I think. And while we're doing that, while you're having a look at the link, I'm going to invite Professor Harden for some closing remarks, and then we'll hand over to Kevin McConville for the results of the vote.
Okay, so again, I look forward to these sessions. I mean, I think each year we always see a series of highly presented and well presented discussions, and also a fascinating range of topics. And I think this year has been no exception. I think we've seen well presented sessions, and I think it's interesting, the range of topics, because I think what you've gathered together some of the major issues facing medical education, including, for example, what are the roles of students in medical education, the issues of diversity. Again, you've addressed that in these presentations. Those are professional identity. How can we improve technology and low-cost technology? The notion of on-the-job learning and clinical reasoning. But I think what they all have highlighted, the need to be, in looking at education, to be innovative and to be creative. And I think that you've brought elements of that into all your presentations as well. So congratulations to everyone. And I look forward to seeing the impact of some of this work you're doing in practice. So thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share some of these experiences with you.
Thanks so much, Professor Harden. And Kevin, are you ready for us to hand over to you for the results?
I think so, yeah. I think judging by the participants' numbers in the room, and all are obviously invited to vote, we're pretty much there within that. So just again to reiterate, as per Professor Harden's comments, the standard and these students are really very much representative of a lot of the hard work that all of the BMSc Med students have put in this year, with lots of other very similar pieces of work that's going to be really helpful for the medical school and wider part. But looking at the votes as they stand today, the winner this year from the audience is Caroline Armstrong. So very well done to Caroline.
Thank you.
So I know, Caroline, that you will hopefully get to meet Professor Harden hopefully in person later on in the year. There'll be a presentation in conjunction with the postgraduate CME as they present their research findings at a date. I think it's been arranged sometime in September, so hopefully you will see him then. Thank you very much all for attending today, and thank you, Lesley, for Grand Rounds for facilitating this process.
And I look forward to, congratulations, Caroline, and I look forward to the presentation. But really, congratulations to the other 4 as well. I think everyone deserves congratulations and a big clap. I think it's even virtually. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And it just remains to say, as always, that if you want to catch up with any of our Grand Rounds presentations, that they're all on our YouTube channel. If you search for Tayside Grand Rounds, and we'll see you again next week.